At its peak, this company controlled more land than the entire British government. It fielded an army larger than any European nation on earth. It taxed 90 million people. It ran its own courts, printed its own currency, and waged its own wars. And yet, in almost every history classroom on earth, it gets one paragraph. 1. The East India Company. And the reason it gets one paragraph is not because the story is small. It is because the story is enormous and inconvenient. This was not a government. It was a corporation. Privately owned. Answerable, at least in theory, to its shareholders in London. And for over 250 years, it did things that no government ever admitted to doing. The question is not whether this happened. The records confirm that it did. The question is why we were never told the full story and what that silence was designed to protect. It began with a signature. On the last day of the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a group of London merchants the legal right to trade in the East Indies. The document was called a Royal Charter. It gave the newly formed East India Company a monopoly on all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. What it did not anticipate, or perhaps what certain men in the room already understood, was what that document would eventually become. In its earliest decades, the company was exactly what it claimed to be, a trading enterprise. It bought spices, silks, and textiles. It competed with Dutch and Portuguese merchants. It built warehouses. It negotiated with local rulers. It was profitable, but it was not powerful. Not yet. The transformation came gradually, and then all at once. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 is the moment historians mark as the turning point. The company's forces, under Robert Clive, confronted the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Daulah. The battle lasted less than a day. What followed lasted 2 centuries. Bengal, one of the wealthiest regions in Asia, responsible at that time for roughly 12% of the entire world's GDP, became, in effect, company property. Not British Crown property. Company property. This is a distinction that matters enormously. The Crown would eventually take control in 1858. But for a full century before that, the government of Bengal, its taxation, its judiciary, its military, belonged to a private company whose primary obligation was to return profit to its shareholders in London. This is not a metaphor. This is the legal and administrative reality of what occurred. In 1770, 1/3 of Bengal's population perished. Contemporary estimates, including those recorded by company officials themselves, suggest somewhere between 7 and 10 million people. The cause was a catastrophic famine, triggered by drought and compounded by policy. And the policy that compounded it belonged to the East India Company. As the famine spread, the company did not reduce its tax demands on Bengali farmers. It raised them. Revenue collection continued. Grain was exported. The internal company correspondence from this period survives. Officials described the situation in clinical terms: yields, shortfalls, collection rates. The word famine appears rarely. The word revenue appears constantly. This was not chaos. This was accounting. What makes this harder to dismiss is that the company knew. Letters written by Warren Hastings, who would later become Governor General, acknowledged the scale of what was happening. and yet the administrative machinery continued to function as designed. The company's obligation was to its shareholders. And in 1771, despite the famine, it reported record dividends. By the 1780s, the company had moved into another territory entirely, opium. It established a monopoly on opium production in Bengal and began systematically exporting it into China, a trade the Chinese government had prohibited. When Chinese officials attempted to enforce that prohibition in 1839, the result was the First Opium War. The British government sent warships to defend a private company's right to sell a prohibited substance into a foreign nation. This fact appears in the historical record. It does not appear in most curricula. Internal voices occasionally challenged what was happening. Edmund Burke, the Irish-born British statesman, spent years documenting what he called the geographical morality of company rule, the idea that crimes committed far from London were somehow less criminal. He compiled testimony. He named names. The evidence was substantial enough to trigger a parliamentary trial that ran for 7 years. What the trial's outcome reveals is perhaps the most important part of this story. In 1787, the British Parliament impeached Warren Hastings, the former Governor-General of India. The charges were serious. The evidence included documented instances of what Burke described as systematic exploitation, taxation during famine, unauthorized wars, personal enrichment at the expense of the territories the company governed. The trial lasted until 1795. 7 years of testimony, argument, and evidence. Warren Hastings was acquitted on every count. The acquittal was not because the evidence was weak. Historians who have examined the trial records generally agree that the evidentiary case against Hastings was substantial. The acquittal happened because the men judging him shared the same institutional and financial interests as the company. The parliamentary establishment of 1795 was not a neutral party. Many of its members held company stock. What the trial established, perhaps unintentionally, was a legal and political precedent, that a corporation operating in the name of national interest could not be meaningfully held accountable by the institutions that were theoretically designed to oversee it. The company was too large, too profitable, too entangled with British finance and geopolitics to be prosecuted as an ordinary enterprise. This precedent did not end with the East India Company. When the Crown dissolved the company in 1858 following the Indian Uprising of 1857, the mechanisms it had pioneered, corporate jurisdiction over territory, private military force, profit extracted through administrative control, did not disappear. They were absorbed into the architecture of formal empire. And the intellectual framework that justified them, the idea that commerce and civilization were the same project, persisted well into the 20th century. Historians like William Dalrymple, in his 2019 work The Anarchy, have argued that the East India Company represents something genuinely new in world history. The first time a private corporation became, in practice, an imperial power. Not a tool of empire. An empire itself. That argument is now mainstream in academic history. It has not yet become mainstream in the classrooms where most people receive their understanding of this period. Here is the question this story leaves open. If a private company can govern 90 million people, collect taxes, wage wars across 2 continents, survive a 7-year parliamentary trial, and then simply be absorbed into the state when it becomes inconvenient, What exactly is the difference between a corporation and a government? And if that difference can disappear once, what prevents it from disappearing again? If you have a different answer to that question, or if you think the real story goes even deeper, leave it in the comments. We read them. If this is the kind of history that was never supposed to reach you, consider subscribing. There is more where this came from.